many times bigger do you think Africa is than the United States? Twice? 3 times? Wrong. Much bigger than that. You could fit the entire United States inside Africa, fit in all of China, fit in all of India, fit in all of Japan, and still have room left over for almost all of Europe. All of those countries combined are still smaller than one Africa, and that's just the first fact. This video covers 10 geography facts that sound made up, but are completely true. The more you watch, the more you'll realize everything you learned about this planet might have been wrong from the start. Fact 1. Greenland looks almost as big as Africa, but it's actually 14 times smaller. You just saw how massive Africa really is. But the real question worth thinking about is, why has none of us ever noticed this all these years? The answer lies in the very map you learned in school. This isn't a printing error or a random mistake. The map almost the entire world uses to teach geography, called the Mercator projection, was invented by a Dutch cartographer named Gerardus Mercator back in 1569. Its original purpose wasn't to teach geography at all, but to help sailors navigate, since this projection preserves compass bearings as straight lines. But there was a price to pay. To flatten a sphere into a rectangular plane, Mercator had to stretch areas more and more the closer they got to the poles. And Greenland sits extremely close to the North Pole. So what's the result? On the map, Greenland looks about the same size as Africa. But in reality, Greenland covers only about 2.16 million square kilometers, while Africa spans over 30 million square kilometers. That's roughly 14 times bigger. Here's what's striking. This map was created more than 450 years ago purely for maritime navigation, and yet, well into the 21st century, it's still the standard map hanging in classrooms around the world. That means billions of students across generations grew up with a seriously distorted sense of how big the continents actually are, especially making Africa, a truly massive continent, look far smaller and less significant than it really is. And if the size of an entire continent can be distorted for centuries without anyone noticing, the next fact is about to make you question what your own eyes are looking at. Fact 2. Australia is wider than the moon is across. When we think of Australia, most of us picture a large island sitting off on its own in the bottom corner of the world map. Big, sure, but maybe not big enough to stop and really think about. And yet, when you compare it to something you see in the sky every night, the result is enough to stop you in your tracks. The distance from Australia's east coast to its west coast is over 4,000 kilometers. The Moon, Earth's only natural satellite, something humanity spent thousands of years gazing up at and decades of research to finally reach with a spacecraft, has a diameter of only about 3,474 kilometers. In other words, If you could place Australia next to the moon for comparison, the width of a single country on Earth would actually be longer than the diameter of an object out in space. Here's what's interesting. Because of this enormous size, Australia spans 3 different time zones on a single continent, from Perth in the west to Sydney in the east, with a gap of 2 to 3 hours depending on the season. By the time people in Perth are having breakfast, it's nearly midday in Sydney. And yet, on most world maps, Australia still gets pushed down into a small corner next to Antarctica, as if it were just some minor island, not an entire continent large enough to swallow a celestial body whole. But if a continent bigger than the moon already sounds hard to believe, the next fact takes you to a country whose sheer size is almost invisible to the rest of the world, even though it's large enough to swallow up several European nations combined. Fact 3. Algeria could fit more than 4 Frances inside it. If you had to name the largest country in Africa, chances are most people would get it wrong. It's not the Democratic Republic of Congo, not Sudan, not South Africa, it's Algeria, a name that rarely comes up in conversations about the world's biggest countries. Algeria covers about 2.38 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, France, one of the oldest and most influential powers in Europe, covers only about 551,000 square kilometers. That means you could fit more than 4 Frances inside Algeria's borders and still have room to spare. So why is a country this massive practically invisible in the world's collective imagination? The answer lies in its terrain. Over 80% of Algeria is covered by the Sahara Desert and arid, almost uninhabited expanse. Meanwhile, nearly all of the country's population of over 45 million is packed into a narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, making up less than 20% of the country's total area. This creates an interesting paradox. A country with the 10th largest land area in the world, yet because most of its territory is empty desert, it's rarely mentioned as a giant in political maps or geopolitical discussions, even though that's exactly what it is. At one point, before 2011, Algeria was even considered the largest contiguous country in Africa, until Sudan split into Sudan and South Sudan, shifting the rankings slightly. But no matter how the rankings shift, one thing stays the same. Most of us have never realized just how enormous Algeria really is. If a country can hide its massive size behind a blanket of desert sand, the next fact shows you something else entirely. Sometimes, what makes a piece of land extraordinary isn't its area at all, it's its shape. Fact 4. Norway's coastline is longer than Earth is around. If you look at a map, Norway is just a narrow, elongated strip of land hanging off the top of Europe. Nothing special in terms of area, actually smaller than France or Spain. But there's one number about this country that catches even geography experts off guard. the first time they hear it. If you stretched out Norway's entire coastline into a straight line, it would run for over 100,000 kilometers. Meanwhile, going all the way around the Earth along the equator is only about 40,000 kilometers. In other words, the coastline of a single country, if straightened out, would be 2.5 times longer than the circumference of the entire planet we live on. The secret lies in Norway's highly unusual geography. Thousands of narrow inlets known as fjords, deep winding cuts carved into the land by ancient glaciers tens of thousands of years ago. Each fjord twists through mountains, branches off, and coils in on itself like a massive natural maze. And every single bend gets counted in the total coastline length. This is also why measuring any country's coastline isn't as simple as measuring the side of a rectangle. Geographers call this the coastline paradox. The more finely you measure, the longer the coastline becomes, because you start picking up every tiny curve that a large-scale map would otherwise smooth over. With a landscape as densely packed with fjords as Norway's, this effect gets amplified to an almost absurd degree. The result, a country with a land area of only about 385,000 square kilometers has a coastline longer than the Earth wrapped around itself. If geography alone can turn a small country into a giant by a different measure, the next fact takes you off the planet entirely. To compare a country with a planet in our own solar system. Fact 5. Russia has a larger surface area than a planet in our solar system. That might sound like an exaggeration for effect, but this is one of the rare geography facts where checking the actual numbers turns out even more surprising than you'd expect. Pluto once considered the 9th planet of the solar system before the International Astronomical Union reclassified it as a dwarf planet in 2006, has a surface area of about 16.6 million square kilometers. It's a celestial body orbiting the Sun at a distance of over 5.9 billion kilometers, taking roughly 248 Earth years to complete a single orbit. Russia, a country you can set foot in, drive across, or simply see on a map every day, covers over 17 million square kilometers. That means the surface area of a single country on Earth is larger than the surface of an object out in space. To grasp just how massive that is, Russia spans 11 time zones, more than any other country on Earth. While it's still the middle of the night in Kaliningrad, at the western edge of the country, it's already past noon the next day in Vladivostok, at the eastern edge. Russia is so vast that if you separated just its Asian territory, it would still be the largest country in the world. And if you separated just its European territory, it would still be the largest country in Europe. The gap between the two numbers, 17 million versus 16.6 million square kilometers, isn't enormous. But the fact that a country here on our own planet can rival, and even surpass, the surface area of an object out in space is exactly what makes you stop and reconsider how much we tend to underestimate the true scale of the world we live in. Size alone was already surprising enough. But if you think the borders between countries are always clean, straight, logical lines, the next fact will show you. Sometimes, the distance between two global superpowers is as short as a walk. Fact 6. The US and Russia are less than 4 kilometers apart. In most people's minds, the US and Russia are two superpowers sitting on opposite ends of the world, one on the North American continent, the other on the Eurasian landmass, separated by an entire ocean. But there's one spot on the map where the distance between these two countries becomes almost absurdly short. In the Bering Strait, the narrow stretch of water separating Alaska, US from Russia's far east, sit two small islands lying nearly side by side. Little Diomede, belonging to the US, and Big Diomede, belonging to Russia. The distance between them is just 3.8 kilometers shorter than the width of many major cities. In winter, when temperatures drop low enough, the sea between the two islands freezes solid enough that physically a person could walk from US territory to Russian territory in a matter of minutes. But this is exactly where politics steps in. Since this is the border between two superpowers, the area is heavily monitored and guarded, and crossing it without authorization is treated as a serious violation of international law. There have been cases, like American swimmer Lynn Cox in 1987, or a handful of others who deliberately tested this boundary, that turned into sensitive diplomatic incidents, requiring special permission from both governments. Even more interesting, these two islands carry the nicknames Tomorrow Island, Russia's Big Diomede, and Yesterday Island, America's Little Diomede. That's because the international date line runs directly between them. This means that despite being less than 4 kilometers apart, the two islands are nearly 21 hours apart in official time. While the Russian side has already moved into a new day, the American side is still living in the day before. So standing on the shore of Little Diomede on a clear day, you can look out and see Russian territory on the horizon, close enough to spot with the naked eye, yet far enough to be separated by almost an entire day on the calendar. If a national border can be this short visible to the naked eye, the next fact will show you something else. Some countries hold an almost unbelievable number of different slices of time, simply as leftovers from an empire that once stretched across the globe. Fact 7. France holds more time zones than any other country in the world. If you asked which country has the most time zones on the planet, most people would immediately think of Russia or the US, two countries with massive land areas stretching across multiple continents or contiguous time zones. But the real answer belongs to a country that, on the map of Europe, looks only modestly sized: France. If you count only its mainland territory in Europe, France sits within just one time zone. But France is far more than just that. As a legacy of its colonial past, France still holds a whole network of overseas territories scattered across the globe, from Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Caribbean, French Guiana in South America, Réunion and Mayotte in the Indian Ocean, all the way to New Caledonia and French Polynesia out in the Pacific. Thanks to this network of territories spanning every ocean, France holds a total of 12 different time zones, more than any other country on Earth, including Russia, 11 time zones, or the US, 11 time zones counting its territories. That means at any given moment, somewhere under French jurisdiction, it's daytime, while somewhere else, it's the middle of the night. This isn't just an interesting number to toss around. It reflects a deeper geopolitical reality. Even though the French colonial empire officially dissolved by the mid-20th century, its territorial influence is still clearly visible on today's world map. These overseas territories aren't colonies in the old sense. Their citizens hold full French nationality, use the euro, and have representation in the French Parliament. But their very existence is living proof that colonial history still shapes how we draw modern political maps. It's also because of this territorial network that France has the world's second largest exclusive economic zone, EEZ at sea, second only to the US, even though its mainland area ranks only modestly in the global top 50. If a single country can split itself across 12 different time zones thanks to territories scattered around the world, the next fact will show you something else entirely. Sometimes, even a man-made canal can send an entire ship's direction in a way that's completely opposite to what you'd expect. Fact 8. Antarctica is the largest desert on Earth. When people hear the word desert, the first image that comes to mind is usually golden sand, scorching heat, and endless dunes stretching out like the Sahara. But the actual scientific definition of a desert has nothing to do with temperature at all. It's about rainfall. By the official geographic definition, a region is classified as a desert if its average annual precipitation, including snowfall, is below 250 millimeters. And if you apply that standard correctly, the driest place on the planet isn't the Sahara, the Gobi, or the Atacama, it's Antarctica. Most of Antarctica receives less than 200 millimeters of precipitation, mostly in the form of snow per year. In some deep inland regions, like the area near the geographic South Pole, average annual snowfall amounts to the equivalent of just 50 millimeters of water, as dry as or even drier than many parts of the Sahara itself. The reason is that extremely cold air simply can't hold much moisture. The colder it gets, the drier the air becomes. So even though the continent is buried under millions of tons of ice, the amount of fresh rain or snow falling each year is remarkably small. At around 14 million square kilometers, Antarctica becomes the largest desert in the world, larger than the Sahara, about 9.2 million square kilometers, combined with the Arabian Desert. Here's the paradox. Despite holding 90% of the world's fresh water in ice form, Antarctica is one of the driest places humans have ever set foot on. Because of this extreme dryness, some parts of Antarctica, like the McMurdo Dry Valleys, remain almost completely snow-free year-round. And NASA scientists have actually used the area to test equipment before sending it to Mars, since its conditions are considered the closest thing to the Martian surface found anywhere on Earth. If the coldest place on the planet is also its driest desert, the next fact takes you to the top of the world's highest mountain, just to prove that even the title of Closted to outer space doesn't belong where you'd think. Fact 9. Mount Everest isn't the point on Earth closest to outer space. If you asked people which point on Earth is the highest, closest to outer space, almost everyone would answer immediately. Mount Everest, standing at 8,849 meters above sea level. The tallest mountain on the planet, a global icon of mountaineering. But by a different measure, that answer is completely wrong. The Earth isn't a perfect sphere. Due to the centrifugal force created by its rotation, our planet bulges outward at the equator and flattens slightly at the poles. Scientists call this shape an oblate spheroid. The Earth's radius, measured at the equator, is about 21 kilometers greater than the radius measured at the poles. And this is where things get interesting. Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador stands at only 6,263 meters above sea level, nearly 2,600 meters shorter than Everest. But because Chimborazo sits very close to the equator, where the Earth's radius bulges the most, when you measure the actual distance from the center of the Earth to the summit, Chimborazo beats Everest by more than 2 kilometers. In other words, Chimborazo's peak is actually the point on Earth's surface farthest from the planet's center, and therefore, by absolute distance, the point closest to outer space, not Everest. Here's what makes it even more interesting. Everest may not hold the title of Closted to space, but it still holds another title beyond dispute. The lowest air pressure ever recorded at a summit relative to sea level, making it harder to breathe there than on any other mountain, including Chimborazo. So, even though it's not the farthest point from Earth's center, Everest still earns its reputation as the harshest survival challenge humans have ever taken on. This fact also explains why scientists measuring the Earth's precise shape always have to distinguish between two concepts: elevation above sea level and distance from the Earth's center. Because on a planet that isn't a perfect sphere, these two numbers don't always line up, and sometimes the answer to highest isn't the same as the answer to farthest. If even the mountain the whole world recognizes as the roof of the world has to hand over an important title to a peak few people have heard of, the final fact in this video takes you somewhere even more surprising a place, where even the most basic rule about the sun, rising in the east and setting in the west, no longer holds true. Fact 10. In some places on Earth, the sun doesn't rise in the east. Since childhood, we've all been taught a rule that seems unshakable. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It's practically the first truth about astronomy any child learns. But this rule only holds true for most of the Earth, not everywhere. At the polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctic, there are periods of the year known as the midnight sun and the polar night. This happens because of the Earth's axial tilt, about 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the sun. During summer in one hemisphere, that hemisphere's polar region tilts continuously toward the sun for weeks, even months at a time, meaning the sun never actually dips below the horizon. In places like Svalbard, Norway, deep within the Arctic Circle, the sun barely sets for about 4 straight months each year, from mid-April to late August. During that entire stretch, instead of rising in the east and setting in the west along a familiar arc, the sun travels in a circle nearly parallel to the horizon, looping around the sky for 24 hours without ever disappearing. In winter, the reverse happens. Those same regions plunge into near-constant darkness, some experiencing a polar night, lasting more than 2 months, where the sun never rises above the horizon even once. People living in towns like Utqiagvik, Alaska, or Tromsø, Norway, have to get used to waking up going to work and going to bed in total darkness for weeks on end, an experience that seriously disrupts the body's natural biological rhythm, and part of why rates of seasonal affective disorder, SAD, are notably higher in these regions than the rest of the world. What this means is, the rule, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, something we treat as one of the most basic truths about the natural world, is actually just a regional rule, not a universal law that applies to the entire planet. And that's the final fact in today's journey through 10 geography facts. A journey that began with a map that lied to us and ends with the realization that even the sun doesn't behave the way we've believed our entire lives. So there you have it, 10 geography facts from a map that has misled the entire world for over 450 years to a country where you could walk into a rival superpower's territory in just a few dozen minutes, and ending with the realization that even the sun doesn't always rise in the east the way we've always believed. The thread running through all 10 of these facts, most of what we know for certain about the world is really just what we were taught as children, not necessarily what's actually true. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway of all. The world is always more complex and more fascinating than any map or any obvious rule could ever fully capture. If anything in this video made you stop and think, leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this, Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.